I mentioned earlier, as far as there's a certain section in the book that I kind of really resonated with. It was about, you're talking about internal meltdowns and self-harm. It says, I knew what being good looked like at school. It looked like sitting still in a chair, doing schoolwork quietly and not getting into fights with other kids. It also meant achieving and making your parents proud, not something that I could claim. I could see there are other children who could do this sort of good. And I knew that I wasn't like them. And I found that so impactful, so important. If you are caring for someone else, whether paid or unpaid, and no matter how many hours you do it, did you realise that you may be missing out on thousands of pounds of discounts for things that you may use every day? The Able to Care podcast is proud to be sponsored by the UK's #1 carers card. Started by two best friends who recognise that carers deserve better and are 100% committed to helping to change the lives of all carers and bringing them together as a strong community. Carers Card UK provides support, recognition and rewards. It offers reassurance by providing an ID card that helps access emergency information when needed, while also unlocking discounts, a wellbeing hub, a carers circle tool and a community through their app. All of this for less than the price of a box of chocolates a year. There are discounts on gym membership, days out, electrical goods, clothing and even glasses. Let others know you care while taking a little care of yourself with an ID card you can be proud of. Visit carerscarduk.co.uk/promo code /able to care today to order yours. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Able to Care podcast. I'm your host, Andy Baker, and today I am thrilled to be joined by Julia Daunt and Ruth Fidler, co-authors of Being Julia. Julia was diagnosed at 12 years old with a condition called Pathological Demand Avoidance, as well as ADHD and psychotic episodes, and has courageously shared her personal journey of growing up with PDA in a world that often struggles to understand it. Julia is now a PDA advocate, public speaker, and blogger. Her story explores the challenges she's faced from childhood into adulthood and how she navigates daily life. Ruth is an experienced education consultant with over 22 years of experience. I think it's worked out about 32 years you've been doing it now, or something like that. I did some calculations. Working in special education, specialising in autism, PDA and emotional wellbeing. She now works across the country, providing training and consulting around these subjects. Together, they've written Being Julia, which I have my copy here, which offers an intimate look at Julia's life while providing invaluable insights and strategies for understanding and supporting those with PDA. So thank you so much, both of you, for travelling over and joining. It's really appreciated. So I'd love to kind of start off with the book a little bit and then we'll dive a bit more into PDA if that's okay. So obviously it is quite a deeply personal book, like really delves into all of your history and all of your life, Julia. Would you mind telling us kind of how you guys met and how you came to write it and put it together?
Yeah. Well, we met quite a long time ago, at least 10 years ago, probably. And we've sort of done various projects together and given various talks and various conferences together. And then quite a while ago, you said to me, didn't you? Oh, I want to write my story and would you help me? And obviously I was thrilled to have been asked. But we didn't really get something publishable on paper for quite a long time. And then came lockdown and we were in touch with each other and we said, right, come on, if we don't do it now, we never will. Yeah. So while we were all stuck at home, that's what Julia and I worked on. And we kind of flipped how we had been approaching it, because before that time, I'd felt very much that I didn't want to take over and I didn't want to patronize you in any way. So I'd very much said to you, well, you write something and then I'll have a look at it and we'll do it that way round. But actually, with hindsight, that put quite a bit of pressure on you to come up with the content, which didn't work. And also it meant that I was editing what you'd written, which was less comfortable to you. So we flipped it and we decided together what the topics were that we wanted to cover. And we determined a bit of a structure for the book. And then we'd have phone calls every week, didn't we?
Yeah.
Every Friday at 10 o'clock. And you phoned me when you were ready. I don't think it ever was 10 o'clock, but it was a little after.
Yeah.
Because you're brilliant at just talking on the phone. And I gave you a choice of, do you want to talk about this today or that today? And I'd be frantically writing it down. And then you edited what I'd written.
Yeah.
And that's how we got the book done.
Yeah.
And it worked. So we did a book all through the summer, really, wasn't it? It wasn't.
Yeah. So it took you just one summer, was it, that you put this together in total? Is it?
Yeah.
So once you got going with it, it moved quite quickly.
But before that, when
we were at home every day, weren't we?
were. But before that, I think it had been a couple of years of trying the old way of, me. And I think if you'd actually compiled what I'd written in those couple of years, it would have maybe made a chapter.
Right,
in amount of words.
Yeah.
But it was just a paragraph here and a paragraph there that made no sense.
Right.
To the last one. So not really a book, is it?
No, absolutely. Well, it's good that you managed to kind of get that flexibility to flip it round and try something different and having that kind of time to do that, I suppose.
Yes.
You kind of mention lockdown quite a lot within the book and stuff. And I found some aspects of that quite interesting. And I think many of the neurodivergent community, particularly those on the autistic spectrum, found lockdown quite positive. And you talk about that as much as there's a lot of negative sides to it, but it kind of reduced the stress significantly, gave you time to focus on the things that you kind of enjoyed doing and being in comfort zone. So yeah, I think there was a lot of people during that time that it worked for. I wrote my book during lockdown as well. So,
there we go. Very productive time in the publishing world.
Because it was good because, obviously Ruth is busy, but obviously during lockdown wasn't. So it meant that we both had time, to spend on this project. Whereas, if we try doing it now, I'm busy now doing, because I am a trainer for the PDA Society as well. So trying to fit that in now would be really hard. So it was time well spent, wasn't it? So.
It really was, yeah. And it was lovely because we had a bit more control as well about how we put the book together, because this was not the first book that I've worked with the publisher on. So there was a bit of a relationship there. And that meant that we could have some influence over the cover design and things, which was really important to you.
And the brownie recipe.
And the brownie recipe.
I noticed the brownie recipe, which I might be trying at some point.
Yes.
It's a very important addition to any book.
Yeah. I think it should be universal. Some kind of
some recipe,
recipe in there somewhere, definitely.
A signature dish.
Well, it's nice now because I know now that long after I'm gone, the book remains, and so just the brownie recipe.
Yeah.
So.
I think a lot of the other books that you've written are much more factual based. Is that right as well?
Yeah.
And this one's very much that kind of, again, from the full perspective of the lived experience and stuff like that. Really a different blend of it, isn't it?
Yes.
Which I found quite very insightful. It's nice to hear, the words from the person rather than necessarily the clinical perspective of what it meets in the diagnostical criteria, as you mentioned in there, kind of, but this is what it actually feels like. This is actually what I experienced. And I'll talk about one bit later that really, really touched me. So obviously there is people who are going to be listening who don't really know what pathological demand avoidance is, or may not have heard of it and maybe seen the PDA at some point. You mentioned the PDA Society there. So how would you guys kind of describe it if you were going to try and explain it to somebody else?
Well, I think probably the best way to understand PDA is to remember that it's a profile within autism. So if you think of it having its roots and origins within autism, you would expect to see some of those same core characteristics that we see in other autistic people in somebody with a PDA profile. But then on top of that, there are other distinctive characteristics that are impacting on PDAs. And those are that some of those are that there's a different emphasis in how their core autistic characteristics come through. So there's a different quality and emphasis in their social interaction. But then things are a bit more distinctive to a PDA profile, and that is the real hypersensitivity to everyday demands of ordinary life. So lots of us may avoid doing all sorts of things that we don't feel like doing, or maybe aren't very good at doing, or have gone off the idea of doing, or whatever it is. But where we talk about that avoidance in PDA profiles, it's very much outside that range of ordinary. And it's really relating to anxiety and to overload. And that has its roots in this hypersensitivity to everyday demands. And those demands, it's important to recognize, are not just the external demands of everyday life, like somebody telling you, come here, do that, put this over here, but are internally generated demands as well of, I would quite like to do that thing, but now I've thought of it being a nice thing to do, it's triggered my avoidance. And also it can pertain to things that are within that person's capability of doing. So that's quite counterintuitive for some supporting adults, of children and young people, or of other adults, to be a bit confused about, but I know you can do this, or I know you did this yesterday. What's getting in the way today? And what I suppose I would say is that that's the right question to ask. What's getting in the way today? But ask it with an open mind so that you're really listening to understand the answer. Don't ask it from a point of judgment.
Yeah. Or because I'm still trying to coerce you to do this as well. Yes. Still trying to understand.
Yeah. I don't know whether you've got anything to add to that.
So yeah, direct demands are hard to tolerate or follow. But actually, self-imposed demands, so things that I want to do, things that I enjoy, are actually the hardest to overcome. And I think a lot of people sort of think to themselves, well, if I don't ask anything of Julia, she'll be fine. She'll be able to manage. And it's actually, the pressure I put on myself is greater.
And it's kind of, I think you mention it in the book, but expectations, isn't it? It's kind of whether that be self-imposed expectations of I should be able to do this, or I want to be able to do this, and then not being able to do that. But also expectations of things like social expectations. For instance, you should go to this thing and you should enjoy it. Well, straight away, that's an expectation. I give you this gift, or I
should like it. Yeah.
Yeah. Or you mention it in the book of kind of the, like, getting praise or getting some kind of appreciation. Is a case of, you're expecting me to react a certain way to this, and therefore that feels overwhelming, anxiety provoking, and therefore I can't do it.
And also, there's now an expectation to do that again.
Yeah.
If not better.
Yeah.
You know, when a child brings home a piece of work from school, mum and dad are very proud. The teacher's very proud. But there is that expectation that next week's work will be better. Your handwriting will have improved. Your colouring will have got better. So there's quite a lot with those.
Can I ask you, do you think is that a cognitive process, or is it just an automatic process? Are you aware of it when it happens, or is it completely almost non-conscious, and it's then something you kind of realise afterwards?
I'm not aware at the start of it, but I'm aware of the feeling that it's left. So if that makes sense. So I'm not aware that I'm overwhelmed at the time, say a room is clapping. But it's after I'm like, okay, that was too much, you know.
Are you able to describe the feeling that you have? Is it a tiredness, like a reduction in energy? Is it kind of almost the anxiety response that kicks in afterwards? It's
anxiety. It honestly feels like my skin is crawling. It's that uncomfortable. It's almost like a lack of self-esteem, but that's not something that I actually have. But it is that very uncomfortable. You know, like how some people, when they're given a compliment, they just, no. And it's that kind of, but bigger.
Yeah. That's exactly the analogy I was thinking of, like when people, you look lovely, and they do, don't say that, I don't like compliments. And yeah, exactly. And I know I've experienced that to a little bit degree, as you said, but it's the amplification of that, isn't it? And that's, obviously you mentioned in the book about the terminology, the language. And I think there's some people who, the language that's used, pathological demand avoidance, does sound kind of almost slightly negative or slightly derogatory. But I think you mentioned in the book that it's actually quite an important use of the term, isn't it? Because it's the pathological bit is detrimental to, you know, you can't do things you want to do.
And it's in everything.
Yeah.
You know, if I was just to say I was demand avoidant, well, that could be just over filling out a tax return. It doesn't give someone that magnitude. So it is with everything. It's not, I can't cherry pick. I can't say, well, today I'm only going to avoid this and this, but I'm going to do these things. It's, yeah.
I think it's the PDA Society that have a video that covers a few different examples, and I went and watched that video, and I've been aware of PDA for a while. There was a story from a lad whose family had a pet dog, and he couldn't even throw the stick for the dog. He didn't want to upset the dog. He didn't want to be mean to the dog. He wanted to throw the stick for the dog, but couldn't even, because it was an expectation. It was a demand, and it was too much in that moment. And that was a really interesting kind of something I'd never even thought of as being an expectation that somebody would feel.
And I think it's really important to reflect on what we actually mean by language as well as what we don't mean by language. And we certainly, there's no sense at all of pathologizing individuals.
Yeah.
But it's about looking at the way that anxiety and that demand avoidance expresses itself, and it expresses itself to a pathological degree, i.e. it's a core part of that person's neurological makeup, and it's exactly as Julia says, it's sort of outside their deliberate choice or control, and often to the point that there are things that are avoided that are against their best interests, or things that they would enjoy.
Yeah, a lot of PDAs, I'm quite bad with drinking, so I will avoid drinking. Some PDAs might avoid going to the doctor, even though they really need to. So it can be all sort, as well as avoiding tax returns. Obviously, they're always avoided.
Yes.
We're all up at midnight on the last day, aren't we?
Yeah.
But it's I don't even need to say anything out loud. I can just think to myself, I'm going to go in the craft room today. And as soon as I've had that thought, it's like, no, not now, you're not. So that's quite frustrating.
Obviously, in the story that you talk about, obviously, this was something that was not really understood. It was very early stages, that was kind of being recognised and being aware of. You obviously experienced a lot of people not understanding you, in your early life. Would you mind kind of expand that? How were you perceived by others through the journey that you went through? How do you think people thought of you?
I think they were puzzled by me, certainly. A lot of teachers were scared of me. And there was a lot of blame from them, blaming mum. And yeah, I was just treated as naughty, really. That was pretty much it. So, but yeah, there were a few compassionate people along the way who didn't know that I had PDA. But they knew that it wasn't deliberate.
Yeah.
They didn't know what to do with me. But they knew it wasn't a deliberate thing, and they tried their best. But obviously, if you don't know what something is, you can't help someone, can you? So, yeah. It was interesting.
Yeah.
And some of the things that you've shared with me over the years very much come from that position where, particularly when you were a younger child, that people were just looking at what was happening. They weren't really asking, why is this happening?
Yeah, well, they didn't in those days, did they? It was just you and naughty going to stand in the corridor or face the wall, or, yeah. Spent a lot of time doing that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. Yeah. There's a story in there, actually, that where you were sent to the headmasters or whoever it was for however many times, absolutely, and they kept the notes that were a letter home or a disciplinary right next to the cupboard that also had the rubbers that were kind of for rewards and stuff like that, and it was quite poignant the way you kind of said, I always hoped for the rubbers, but I think you said you had one in the whole time you were there.
Yeah, and one in about 2 years of schooling. So
yeah. So it sounds like you got a lot of attention.
I did.
But it wasn't
I did. I
good
was sent
attention.
home on average 2 or 3 times a week.
Really?
It's quite a lot.
It's always a shame when that attitude pertains to young people nowadays still, because it's not just that people have missed asking the why question.
Yeah.
It's also they've not thought through what is the impact of sending this person home a couple of times a week, and what messages are they getting from that, and how is that helping them to come back with a sort of a spring in their step the next time. And so, yeah, it's really hoping that supporting adults, whatever their role, widen their lens and take in a much broader range of factors when they're supporting children.
One of the things that I kind of picked up in the book, and maybe I felt some empathy towards, I hope you don't mind me talking about your mum. Obviously, there were some challenges she went throughout. There were some bits in there where I kind of like, what an amazing woman in some way. She did some amazing things, and maybe she learned to understand you better throughout your life. Do you think, did she go against the grain, or did she start to listen to certain people? Or
no, she I think I was about 7, and she'd been trying obviously for 7 years to get me to go to bed. And she just basically gave up and said, right, I've had enough. I can't get this child to bed. She knew nothing about PDA. She knew nothing about autism or ADHD or anything. So it was literally her giving up. So what she did was she brought me a little television and said, I don't care what you do in your room, but you have to be in there by 8 and don't come out. So I did. So I stayed up watching telly, and in true PDA style, I learnt by natural consequences. So obviously I stayed up the first few weeks watching telly till 4 a.m. Then I'd fall asleep in class, which I didn't like because I quite enjoyed school. So I soon got myself into a routine of going to bed about 9 o'clock. So once my mum inadvertently started using PDA approaches, it did get a bit easier. But yeah, my mum, just out of frustration, was just trying the opposite, because I've got two older brothers. So I came along and she's like, well, none of this is working. It worked before. It doesn't work now. So, but yeah, she did, I think, start to believe them, that it was all her fault. But she certainly didn't in the early days. So
I think the instinct is, isn't it, when you've got somebody who is desperately needing to keep a level of autonomy, the instinct for people is, well, we need to take away all their control to teach them that they're not allowed it, essentially. And that's where the whole kind of your punishment reward parenting, the typical punishment reward parenting kind of comes into play, that most people are kind of, you do something good, you get a reward, but you do something bad, there's a consequence. And they think that all children should learn from that. And that is the approach that works worst, probably, isn't it, for individuals with a PDA profile?
It is, and for children in general, I think. I mean, my mum did try all that, grounding and smacking and taking away and, punishing by, you've got to do the washing up. Well, she had no plates after that, so because I just smashed them all. So, it didn't work. She did try everything, traditional first. And, but I think children in general benefit from a level of autonomy. To me, there's nothing wrong with saying to a 4-year-old, would you like a ham or a cheese sandwich? What's the harm going to happen by allowing that child to choose? So, yeah, I'm quite big on that.
There's quite an interesting strategy in it, and this would be great to get your kind of feedback. And I know obviously you work with the PDA Society and stuff like that, and or my mindset that if a friend came around my house, I wouldn't go, you're having ham. I'd go, would you prefer a cheese or a ham sandwich? And there's a theory, and I don't know whether this kind of meets your experiences, but you don't see yourself as a child against adults. You see yourself as an equal adult, and they should be treated equally. So therefore, if I was looking to go, hey, do you fancy going out? I wouldn't go, right, you're going out. I'd go, you fancy going out to another adult. Would you say that's true? Does that feel like it kind of resonates?
I still don't recognise age in people. Is that where we're going?
Yeah,
that's where we're going. So I was talking about this the other day, and I've got friends in their 60s, and I count a 9-year-old as a friend, which might seem odd, but I mean, yes, I do obviously see her differently because, when we look after her, obviously I've got to make sure she's safe, etc. But when it comes to having a conversation or playing a board game, I just see her as a friend I'm playing a board game with. It's not, and actually I put, when we have her sister there who's 11, I also put her in charge because she's much more grown up than I am. So, so I'm like, no, we'll leave the 11-year-old in charge. And but certainly in the adult world, I don't see anyone as any better, certainly as anyone else, based on maybe what their qualifications or experience are. I think we're all equal. Which does get you into trouble when the person that you're with doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think it's more challenging for children, isn't it? Because with children, there are those societal
rules.
Yeah. Expectations, norms, whatever you want to call them, that basically the adults are in charge and the children are meant to do what the adults say. But don't worry, because one day you'll be an adult and then it will sort of go on and on.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's all very unspoken, isn't it? I think there are some real advantages to it, and that is the sort of that freedom, that sense of freedom to speak truth to power and to disregard hierarchy and challenge some of those societal norms, etc., etc. But sometimes it can also be indicative that there might be underlying issues for that young person on not quite understanding themselves and not quite having that sense of their social identity and where do I fit into my wider network. So it's balancing those two things.
I was also going to add that a bit controversial, but I never used to stand up for the national anthem because she was just like me. She wouldn't stand up if I put my song on, would she? So was my thing. I mean, I do it now because it's easier just to follow with that one because otherwise you get some glares if you don't stand up for that.
Coming back to children in school, there are often expectations where if the head teacher walks in, everybody stands up.
I didn't.
I
didn't. I refused because we didn't have to do it when the teacher came in. We didn't have to do it when a dinner lady came in. And you're talking to me about respecting adults. And I'm like, but why is this adult better than the ones who I saw actually do work? I mean, I know the head teacher does actually work, but you don't see it, do you? As a child, you don't see any effort. They do a lot. We know this. But as a child,
we know this now.
In a child's black and white view of the world, my teacher works hard. The dinner ladies work hard. The head teacher just
walks into rooms and
goes back out again.
To stand up.
So I had a big difficulty with that because I was like, well, that's not fair. So I just refused to stand. So when I was small enough, they did used to make me stand, but I've always been quite tall and chunky. So there came a time where they actually couldn't do it anymore. The physical standing, but I just didn't see how it was fair.
Let me ask you a question. Do you ever find the pressures of supporting, teaching, or caring for someone else overwhelming and wish you had access to more support and information? The Able to Care podcast, in connection with Able Training, has created the ablehub.uk, where for less than the price of a coffee a week, you can access exclusive podcast content, resources, events, and over 45 certified online courses, covering topics like self-care, understanding dementia, neurodiversity, first aid, conflict management, financial advice, and so much more, with new content and courses being added each month. We are so confident that you will benefit from the Able Hub that we are offering 14 days access completely free of charge. No contract, cancel anytime. Become part of the ablehub.uk community and gain the support, knowledge, and resources you deserve. Don't struggle alone. Be able. Find the link in the description. So obviously we've talked a little bit about some of the challenges and the perceptions that people have or misinterpretations that people have of individuals with PDA, just naughty or difficult or however they perceive them. And we talked about the certain strategies that don't work very well. So what does work better? What have you found for yourself? And also obviously both of you kind of work with a PDA society. So I'm sure you've learned a lot through that as well.
For me, as much autonomy as possible. So obviously that's easier as an adult. Because obviously, when you're a child, you're dictated to when you go here, when you go there. So I do have a lot of support with things like paperwork. Certainly with my work with the PDA Society, my husband Paul sends in my invoices and my timesheets, and he keeps on top of those. So because I wouldn't remember, for one, what I'd done this week, let alone how long that took me to do. So he does all that. So that's his role. Yeah. So just autonomy, basically, just choice and being allowed to move the goalposts slightly. So I suppose the best example of something that people call reasonable adjustments is when I go to the doctors. It actually started in lockdown because they were doing it for everyone, where you weren't allowed into reception. Mm-hmm. So you had to wait outside. So after lockdown, I said, can I carry on with that, please? It worked quite well. So now when we get there, we ring and we tell them we're here. And I wait in the car, and then they come out the fire exit, which means I don't have to walk through reception. I don't have to engage with anyone else. And I just go straight into the consulting room. And that really helps.
I know you've got a card that you carry around with you, don't you? That to help people raise awareness and stuff. And I think you described quite an uncomfortable situation that you went through on the train.
Yeah,
there's a couple of examples there and back, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And with a mix of experience of individuals that you kind of encountered in both of those scenarios. And the card's quite simple as far as just explaining your diagnosis and then kind of what helps for you and stuff. Yeah. And it is that a quiet place and just give me as much choice as possible and let me have time and calm if I need it and stuff like that. Have you, I take it you use that card quite often in quite a few different circumstances?
I do. I tend to leave it for the times where I'm on my own and I'm not able to say that I need space. I tend to just frantically hand it to someone and hope that they know what the word autism means. And then, so yeah, I do use it. And I if I'm at a conference or somewhere busy, I will wear a name badge that basically has got my name on it, but says also I'm autistic.
Yeah. So
just in case. So.
But it sounds like you have quite a few advocates around you as well that kind of support you in that, like yourself, Ruth, and also your partner Paul as well, has become kind of integral to some degree to kind of helping you kind of navigate the world. Yeah, and also you mention him quite often in the book, and it's lovely to hear that kind of serendipitous event and the explanation of, are you ready for this? Because I've got this and this before in that vocal. Obviously his chapter refers to, he's obviously quite a special gentleman in the fact that I was aware that I didn't want to keep her waiting and make her anxious, so I called her back within the hour. I thought was quite lovely and kind of almost that's destined to work, isn't it? To some degree, if you could be that understanding in that early on in the relationship,
especially when you didn't have any idea about what ADHD even was.
Yeah.
That he'd never even he'd heard of it, but he'd heard of it the way people have heard about, unusual diseases. You've heard about it in a film once, but you don't actually know anyone with it because it's very rare. Kind of, he had no clue really what ADHD was. And there wasn't actually much to Google back then about PDA. So that probably didn't take more than an hour.
No.
Just to do that bit.
And you think of the first book that we published was in 2012. So
there wasn't even a book.
in the grand scheme of things, it's quite recent.
Yeah.
And just to sort of pick up on some of the things that you were both talking about there in terms of support that is helpful. I don't think it's that. I don't think it's that we ought to be trying to avoid or protect young people or adults from any expectations, because everyday life is infused with them. Yeah. It's about the perception of demands, and that's the purpose of offering a bit more choice and a bit more autonomy, so that if you don't feel that you're cornered, then you're less likely to respond in a stuck way. Yeah. But I would also say that when it comes to giving choices, it's equally important not to flood somebody with too many choices. So maybe between 2 and 3 choices is ideal, because if you give somebody totally open choice, then actually now they're overwhelmed by something different, which is, I don't know what to choose.
I use the example of going into a Subway. The first time I ever went in a Subway, I nearly had a meltdown because I just wanted a sandwich. Yeah. I was like, what type of bread? Would you like 6 days? What kind of cheese? Do you want it toasted? Do you want the salad? It's like, I just want a sandwich. And it can feel very overwhelming for many of us, too many choices. So again, I think, if people can relate that over to themselves of how they feel, but then amplify that, to tenfold, thousandfold as far as the experience and stuff. One of the things that you mention in the book, put in the book, you've got a kind of a dial analogy as far as looking at kind of the expectations and the resilience to be able to cope with those. Would you mind just expanding on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean that's an analogy that we've used for a long time in our work, particularly my colleague Phil Christie and I, and I'm hoping that sort of message is getting out there now. But this idea being of viewing the dynamic, if you like, as two old-fashioned radio dials, where one dial measures the individual's tolerance to demands, and that, of course, is going to measure their perception of demands. It's also going to measure their internally generated demands and the demands of their sensory system and everything. And then the other dial measures the amount of demand that the people around that individual and the environment is giving out. And the idea being that you try and synchronize those dials as closely as possible, so that if somebody's tolerance to demands, to uncertainty, to environmental expectations increases, then you can be more flexible about increasing the amount of demand placed upon them. But we also have to recognize that one of the diagnostic characteristics is that they're likely to experience sudden changes in mood, and so that can affect it, the dials quite quickly. And so what we would need to do is remain responsive, remain really tuned into that person. And that also suggests a rationale about why it's so important to build trusted relationships with individuals, because most of us are likely to feel more regulated and more open to expectations if we're with somebody that we trust. And if there's that sense of alliance of, we're doing this together, how are we going to get through it? Or there's I'm your safety net. There's a line below which I'm not going to let us fall. So all of those things combined together will support this idea of synchronizing the dials.
It's a much more kind of collaborative approach, isn't it? Of kind of like it's me and you in this together, rather than just kind of, again, the expectation on the one individual to cope with it. And I suppose either parties as well, from others watching on, it isn't one or the other. It's a collaborative approach between the two.
Absolutely. And that's why we taught, in fact, one of the books is called Collaborative Approaches to Learning.
Yeah.
Because it is exactly trying to get at that, at that principle, and particularly collaborating with the young person or the individual PDA, but also where they are still younger, to collaborate with parents, because it's not out of the ordinary that children and young people might come across very differently at home to how they are at school. So to really listen to parents, to believe parents, and to have a holistic view of this person in the round, not just what they're like during those few hours in a classroom.
When it comes to the demands, I think obviously there may be a perception that, so it's a pathological demand avoidance. The individuals can't cope with any demand, but it's a case of it's almost like a threshold of demands, isn't it? I heard it described like a clicker. Like I can cope with 20, but it depends on how intense they are. Or I use the example of like, and I think you might mention this within the book actually, as far as like a bucket, a threshold, a bucket, and every demand is like either an amount of water. So direct demand might be a larger drop than an indirect demand, or a self-imposed demand might be, as you said, or even worse. So it might be like a full glass full, and I can cope with a certain amount of liquid. And I think you have a diagram in there as well of kind of then re-regulating, and then I might be able to cope with some more, but that could be the next day, or it could be next week.
And it also obviously depends on how much is emptied from the night, the day before. So if it's still very full, it's not going to take much the next day to overflow. So, which is why so many PDA, as Ruth mentioned earlier, we know how to do things and we're able to do them sometimes. And that's why sometimes you get with the PDA where they've done it yesterday, but they can't do it today. And there's that confusion then. As you know, from professionals working with them, it's like, well, they did it Monday, why not Tuesday? So
what helps to kind of then empty that bucket or reset or
screens?
Right.
I must confess, it's Murder, She Wrote and Judge Judy.
And they just work for you, so it's almost. Do you think is it almost just being able to switch off at that, or do you still engage in them?
And there's no surprises.
Yeah,
I know exactly at what point everyone's going to do whatever they do.
Predictability of it. Yeah.
And because I've got ADHD, I very often have forgotten who the murderer is. So I still get that element of like, oh,
Still get the dopamine hit from a oh, surprise.
Didn't see that coming.
Even though I've seen it, 200 times, I still forget.
It's going to be very different for different individuals, and Julia is very self-aware and very mature and has learnt all of that over the years. And you've learnt it the hard way, really, haven't you?
Yeah, lots of burnout.
So for any individual, for any of us, we regulate in different ways, and we need different amounts of regulation before we're ready to go again. And particularly when children are younger, what we really want to prioritize for them in their childhood years, as it were, is helping them understand themselves and helping them know what works well for them and what they can access in different environments or in different circumstances as well, so that they can improve their own emotional well-being and start to flesh out their own suite of tools that are going to prepare them for the rest of their lives.
One of the things that's mentioned in there, the Montessori school that you went to in early stages, that you actually found, I think it was when you were very young, wasn't it? Was it nursery? Montessori nursery?
They take you from 2.5 to 5.
And you found that, or you remember that, I think, which is a very young age to remember. Yeah, absolutely. But you found that quite a positive environment and the approach works quite well for you.
Yeah, and again, it's another example of my mum knowing that, because in those days there was very posh private nurseries with, professional people. Then there was playgroups, and she couldn't afford the posh private nursery. For sort of where both parents work, kind of, and and playgroup was just a group of mums with some toys and a village hall. There was no structure, and she knew I wouldn't cope in that. So she was looking around thinking, well, she needs to socialise because my brothers are 10 and 11 years older than me. So I didn't have a sibling at home that I could play with, and so she saw this advert for this Montessori, and she's like, well, what's that? So she went along, and it was really good setting for me. It cost her a fortune,
right? Okay.
And actually worked out to be more expensive than the nursery. So
right,
but it was what I needed, because you could leave lessons, you could just get up and leave and go into another room and do another. There was nobody going, oh, come back, you've not finished. And I was learning French and all sorts of, very, very posh toddler.
Yeah, very, very posh toddler.
But it was good. And but even then I managed to escape twice.
Okay.
It wasn't far from home, but I did go home.
Right. So. Before the age of 5. Wow.
Yeah, I was leaving the house at midnight from like 2 onwards. So.
But again, it sounds like there's a maturity, the behaviour that, that's not typical 5-year-old behaviour. That's maybe you'd be expecting that more 11, 12 kind of might get that at school. And then obviously, but 11 and 12, you're engaging in behaviours that were more typical of maybe 16, 17, 18-year-old and stuff like that. There seemed to be a maturity that drove through, or a self-perception of maturity. I don't know.
It was, I even managed at 2 to close Gatwick, or 2 or 3 to close Gatwick, because I went missing. So they closed all the doors and delayed flights until they'd found me. So that's one of my greatest achievements, I feel.
So when you're helping others, when you're working with others, teaching others in the, obviously teaching for yourself and working with the PDA Society and stuff and educating, what are the kind of main messages that you try and get over to, whether it be parents or caregivers that are struggling to know what to do and how to help?
Well, I think the starting point is to listen, to understand what is somebody's experience, whether that's understanding their experience as a parent as well as understanding their children's experience. It's also to help give them useful information. So information about understanding PDA, and you can hear so many examples running through Julia's story of where that understanding was missing or lacking, that actually it led to really unhelpful interventions or judgments. It's also helping families and education providers understand that there are things that can be done, that can be really supportive, really helpful, really positive, that actually just require a shift of ethos or attitude, that are about them accepting this person for who they are, working with them, building a close relationship of trust and respect with them. And then in terms of the style of approaches, using more flexible, creative, person-centered, interest-based type of ways of engaging that person. Because invariably, I don't know how many autistic and PDA individuals I must have known over the last 35 years, quite a lot, I imagine. I've never yet met somebody who doesn't want social relationships and doesn't want to do well in their own way and isn't interested in learning. So if that's what we have as our raw material, then I think it's up to us as educators and supporting adults to think, how do we engage with those people and how do we work together on that? Back to your idea of pulling out collaboration.
Don't sweat the small stuff. Parents get very stressed and they've got their 8-year-old and they're convinced that the outlook is bleak. And I'm like, well, it is at the minute where you are is bleak, but life changes. You know, if you'd taken me at any sort of snapshot in that book when I was younger, you might not say she's going to be sat here in 2024 doing a podcast. You're going to say she's probably going to be in a cell somewhere. So, it doesn't have to be bleak. And with the right support, PDAs can do their own, it's still their own thing. But we can contribute to society and I think be quite a positive thing in society. Because parent friends of mine, with and without PDA children, are now using PDA approaches, whether there's autism in their family or not, and all the children are benefiting. When I look after those 2 girls, I use PDA approaches. They're not formally diagnosed, but I have, obviously assessed them myself. And so they're not PDA, but there's definitely an autistic ADHD ness in them. And but yeah, they love it. They love the choice. When we go into a shop, I give them £1, £2 or whatever, and I say, off you go. Rather than you can only have, I'm like, just the shop is yours. Just as long as you've got the money, teach them the money skills. And it's quite lovely.
And I think one other thing, sorry, just to add in there, would be that I would want as a key message for people to take away this notion that PDAs can't help, won't.
Yeah.
So that there are definitely moments where they won't do that thing, whatever it is. But I would want anybody around them to recognize that they can't help the fact that they won't at that point. And it's up to us to be thinking, what do they need right now? And what can I do differently to support that? And that might be that we need to check back in with ourselves about, have we given enough options? Have we over exaggerated the perception of demand? Have we allowed enough recovery time? Have we given access to regulation? And who is maybe better than me in this moment to be able to support this young person?
That ties really nicely. As I mentioned I mentioned earlier, as far as there's a certain section in the book that I kind of really resonated with. It was something, and I passed on. It's something I've been trying to get over, and I just thought this was, hearing it from the person themselves was just amazing. It was about, you're talking about internal meltdowns and self-harm. It says, I knew what being good looked like at school. It looked like sitting still in a chair, doing schoolwork quietly and not getting into fights with other kids. It also meant achieving and making your parents proud, not something that I could claim. I could see there are other children who could do this sort of good, and I knew that wasn't I wasn't like them. And I found that so impactful, so important, that I described it last night to somebody. I was talking to somebody about this last night, saying I was at a meeting, and they're having challenges with their child, and there's a suspicion of autism and stuff, and there's some demand avoidance. ODD has been thrown around, and we were kind of talk about it, going like a phobia of spiders. Like, anybody who has a phobia of spiders logically knows it can't hurt me. I know it's silly. I know it's irrational, but that doesn't stop you desperately wanting to running away and every part of your soul wanting to kind of think. It doesn't matter whether you know it logically. You can't help what your body does as a result of that. I felt that's the same. I know how to be good. That doesn't mean I can help what my body does and my brain does in that moment that inhibits me from being able to do that. It's not a choice, no more than you being afraid of the spider is a choice.
Yeah. To me, to not avoid demands would be like if I said to you, don't breathe. Like, it's as natural to me as breathing is. It's not, and it's not, I don't sit there and I think, right, today, don't fancy that, so I'm not doing it. I mean, there are days, and Paul can tell when I'm being demand avoidant and when I'm being lazy, because normally if I ask him to do something and it's because I just can't be asked, there's normally a giggle at the end. Yeah. So I say, can you take the bins out? Ha ha, and he's like, yeah, okay, fine, this once.
Yeah.
So, and usually when I ask people to do something for me because I'm unable to do it, it's usually followed by either a sorry or a thank you, depending on what I've dropped them in.
Yeah.
Because it might be very short notice. It might have been a form that I've had a week to fill out. I've been trying to do it myself, and then I tell Paul we've got 10 minutes, and he's like, "Great, thanks for the."
And that's back to the point about it being pathological in its nature, isn't it? That it is that integral part of somebody's wiring and their profile.
Yeah. I don't want to let anybody down. I don't want to be bad. I don't want to not do this, but I just can't help
and
it.
you don't realise you're avoiding until you're actually doing it. And then you're like, oh, here we go again.
Yeah. And just to also pick up one other thing from your spider example, actually, if somebody is really anxious about spiders, they become quite hypervigilant if they're going into any new room. Well, is there one in here? And where might it be? And was that one? And And so that degree of hypervigilance, whether it is deliberate or not, cognitive or responsive, is actually exhausting. And I think that's something that comes through in a lot of PDAs that I've known, is that they just get exhausted by everyday life, because you think of the different types of demands. And I know that in the book, we talk about the different styles of demands, that it's not just those direct ones or the perceived ones or the sensory ones. It's also the indirect ones, the social ones, etc., etc. Those pertain to every single day, and particularly for children who tend to have a bit less control and influence over their life, and particularly around school, because whether you had a brilliant day yesterday or a really tough day yesterday, you're still expected to go back to school tomorrow.
And to sort of explain demands a bit, there's something we use in training, which is we ask the attendees, how many demands do you think there are in the process of making toast? And I joke and say 1 because I just get Paul to do it. But they've worked out to be between 35 and 40 individual demands within that one process of just making toast. So there would be like these, what bread do I use? Is it in date? What butter do I use? Do I want anything on it? How long do I toast it for? Do I cut the crusts off? Do I want triangles or squares? Just the list is endless. And all those tiny little demands within that one process of making toast all adds to that bucket of water. So that's why demands within demands are harder, So that's why most PDAs struggle with, not so much with one slightly larger task, like filling in a form. That's not too bad. But they struggle more with washing, dressing, eating, those things that have so many. I mean, if you think when you're in the shower, you've got to get undressed, you got to turn the shower on, you've got to get in, you've got to wash. How do I wash? What shower gel do I, lots of little steps in order to have a shower. So that's why, when I explain to parents, that's why your PDAs struggle so much with brushing their teeth or going to the toilet and, that kind of stuff. So,
and also I would like to hope that people listening to this have an understanding that, Julia is an amazing person and does events like this just fabulously. And that is absolutely true and needs celebrating and recognizing. We also need to understand what Julia needs to do wrapped round that in order to manage today. So this isn't just right, I'm doing all this list of demands and then I'm slipping in a podcast and then I'll go on to do loads of other things later today or for the rest of this week. That actually you need to cushion bigger events with a lot of opportunities for regulation and, like you say, to just let some things go.
So I'd just like to kind of draw it to a bit of a close, that's all right. Obviously, we've touched on masking, we mentioned it. And obviously there's a whole section in your book talking about meltdowns as well. And I think people have a preconceived idea of what a meltdown is. And what I quite liked within the book is you kind of broke it down. Meltdowns have changed for you depending on age. I think you talk about your typical kind of what's perceived as maybe some people would describe as a tantrum. I know that's not correct within younger children, but then became a very different form of meltdown within your adolescent years and stuff. Would you mind just talking about those and kind of, so what is a meltdown for you?
I have a few sort of flashpoints, but you're not a psychiatrist, so we're doing all right.
Yeah.
And we're not here today to talk about my medication. So that, again, we're fine. But if you were to do either of those things, I usually say a very naughty word and leave. And I would swing the door. I've left holes where the door handles hit the wall. And I leave. I usually leave Paul left behind. And that's his job then to apologise, make excuses, and then we leave. And then I'll go and cry and swear a lot. So that's my meltdown now when I'm triggered. If it's a build-up one, like it was on the train, I surprised myself and went mute, which I didn't think was a possibility for me. But I did. I couldn't speak, and all I did was just stand there and cry. So, and I do throw the occasional object, like chips. They're quite good to throw at people. Paul. If he's annoyed me, I throw a chip. But yeah, they were certainly much more explosive when I was a child. Chairs, tables, thrown at people, not just wherever. Yeah. Occasionally it would be the person was inadvertently hit. But yeah, it was, I don't know if I was deliberately aiming at people, but I don't think I was, but I wasn't actually actively avoiding. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I didn't think, I won't throw it there, because you're just throwing it. You're not thinking, are they there or are they not there? So,
but maybe you were throwing it at the source of the problem rather than throwing it at that person.
Well, thank you very much for both of you. It's been genuinely an interesting conversation and an experience. So, for anybody out there who's watched or listened, if you found anything we've talked about useful, interesting, please reach out, like, comment and share. Do check out the book. I'll show the cover so people can kind of see. As far as, I'll make sure I show it. Say again. Higher. There you go. Perfect. Perfect. Thank you very much.
You.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Have you ever encountered an adult or child's behaviour that has felt difficult, overwhelming, or challenging? Have you sometimes felt at a loss of what to do, or know that you didn't handle it quite right? People are complex and unpredictable, and their behaviour can be like the weather. We've all made the mistake of looking out the window and feeling safe to wear shorts, but 5 minutes later, wishing for an umbrella. What if, like a weatherman, you understood how humidity, temperature, and pressure all come together to cause the weather, allowing you to better prepare, predict, and respond, and prevent ever having a picnic ruined by a thunderstorm ever again. My book, called Targeting the Positive with Behaviours that Challenge, helps you to become the weatherman of behaviour. It provides you with a toolkit to increase competency, confidence, resilience, and empathy, so you feel more assured about how to respond to distressed or dysregulated behaviours in others, including those affected by trauma, mental health, neurodiversity, learning disabilities, or dementia. Build better connections, achieve de-escalation, and improve outcomes for yourself and those you engage with my celebrated 6-stage target model, a step-by-step process to reduce distress for everyone. Discover my empowering, person-centered guide in Targeting the Positive, written by me, Andy Baker, available from online bookstores worldwide. Find a link in the description and order today.